After being away on an extended business trip for nearly 3 weeks, I decided to return home earlier than expected. The trip had been long, exhausting, and full of last-minute meetings, and I missed the comfort of my own bed and the silence of my quiet suburban neighborhood. My flight landed just after 6 p.m., and by the time I grabbed my luggage and drove back, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden-orange glow across the houses on my street. There was a strange feeling of both excitement and relief as I turned into the cul-de-sac. I was looking forward to surprising my wife and kids. They weren't expecting me for another 3 days. I pictured the look on my daughter's face when I'd walk in unannounced, with a grin and gifts from my trip in hand. As I slowly rolled into the driveway, I noticed something odd. The lights in my house were off, except for a small glow coming from the kitchen window. That wasn't unusual for a weekday evening, but something else caught my attention. A figure standing across the street on her porch, phone in hand, staring directly at me. It was Karen. Every neighborhood has one, and ours had her. Karen was the self-declared eyes and ears of our homeowners association. She never missed an Amazon delivery or a leaf out of place. If your lawn was a quarter-inch too high or your garbage bins were visible for longer than 30 minutes after collection, you'd get a notice sometimes before you've even stepped outside. I'd dealt with her passive-aggressive notes on the mailbox and unwanted reminders slipped under my door more times than I could count. But this time, she wasn't even pretending to hide her surveillance. I tried to wave as I got out of the car, but she didn't respond. Instead, she seemed to be whispering into her phone, her eyes never leaving me. I shrugged it off, assuming she was probably updating her book club or gossip group about my early return. I grabbed my suitcase, slung my laptop bag over my shoulder, and walked up to the door. The porch light flickered on as the motion sensor caught me, and I entered the code on the smart lock. The door clicked open, and I stepped inside, the familiar scent of home instantly relaxing me. Everything was just as I'd left it, my coat rack by the door, the scattered school shoes near the hallway, and the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I dropped my bags, kicked off my shoes, and let out a long sigh of relief. Home. Not even 10 minutes passed before I heard a strange sound outside, tires crunching over gravel, a low radio buzz and faint voices. I peeked out the window and saw flashing red and blue lights reflecting off my neighbors' cars. A police cruiser had pulled into my driveway. At first, I thought maybe something had happened nearby. Then, I noticed Karen still on her porch, pointing at my house and nodding to the officers. My heart sank. I hadn't even had time to sit down, and now there were 2 uniformed officers walking toward my front door. Could knock, unsure whether to be confused or concerned. One of them looked at me, hand resting on his belt, and asked, "Sir, do you live here?" Everything suddenly made sense. Karen hadn't just been nosy, she'd called the cops. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning of something much bigger than a mistaken identity. It wasn't just about me coming home early. It was about control, territory, someone who believed they had authority over everyone else's life. Karen had always been a problem. But until that night, I hadn't fully grasped just how far she would go to assert her imagined authority over the neighborhood. She didn't hold any official title, yet she acted like the HOA president, the neighborhood sheriff, and the moral compass of the entire block, all rolled into one. She had this ability to make everyone feel like they were constantly being watched, and in many ways, we were. From her second-story window, or the edge of her perfectly trimmed lawn, Karen always had eyes on the street. She kept a notebook. Yes, an actual notebook filled with dates, times, and what she called infractions. Whether it was a kid riding a bike on the sidewalk, a package left unattended on someone's porch, or a lawn that hadn't been mowed in exactly 8 days, Karen had it logged. When I first moved in, I thought she was just a little eccentric. She brought over cookies and a binder filled with useful information, which mostly included a printout of HOA rules and suggestions for improving curb appeal. I thanked her politely and filed the binder under a pile of mail I'd never read. But it didn't take long to realize her friendliness was just a thin veil over her obsession with control. Every week or two, I'd find one of her notes, just a reminder. Trash cans must be stored out of view within 2 hours of pickup. Or kindly ask your guests not to park facing the wrong direction on the street. It wasn't long before the rest of the neighbors started jokingly calling her neighborhood watchdog, though never to her face. Nobody wanted to be on her radar. I managed to stay out of her crosshairs for the most part by following the rules and keeping interactions brief. But this time, I hadn't done anything wrong at all. I was just coming home, still to Karen the fact that I didn't follow the expected schedule made me suspicious. That's all she needed. In her world, deviation equaled danger. What really got to me was how fast it happened. She saw me pull into my own driveway and didn't even wait to observe. She didn't ask questions or call a neighbor. She didn't approach me, wave, or speak. She simply assumed that someone me didn't belong, and she acted on that assumption with absolute certainty. I imagined her standing by the window, dialing 911, using phrases like suspicious person and possible break-in. Maybe she even said I was carrying something that looked like a weapon when I was just dragging my suitcase up the steps. This wasn't just Karen being nosy. It was Karen using the police as a tool to enforce her worldview, one where everything had to stay within her neat little lines. Anything unexpected, unscheduled, or out of her control became a threat. And it wasn't just me. Over the past year, I'd heard stories, quiet grumblings at block parties, whispers during trash day. A teenager who got the cops called on him for walking home too late. A delivery driver questioned for looking lost. A moving truck temporarily blocking. Her view of the mailbox had sparked a written complaint to the HOA. Karen's behavior wasn't just annoying. Ken Merritt was dangerous. The fact that she had watched me exit my own car, enter my own house, with a key and still called the cops, meant she didn't even try to consider that I might belong. To her, I was a problem that needed to be reported, and that mindset, I realized, was something I could no longer ignore or tolerate. What I thought would be a quiet night home turned into a wake-up call not just about Karen, but about the way unchecked authority can quietly take over where it's not welcome. The knock on the door wasn't loud or aggressive, but it carried the weight of authority. When I opened it, 2 uniformed officers stood on my porch, their faces a mix of professionalism and mild concern. One of them, a tall man with a calm demeanor, stepped forward and said, "Good evening, sir. Received a call about a potential break-in at this address. Do you live here?" For a split second, I didn't know how to answer. Not because I didn't live there, but because I was stunned. Even after seeing the flashing lights and Karen's finger pointing, I hadn't fully processed that I was about to be treated like a suspect at my own front door. I quickly gathered myself and nodded. "Yes, I live here. This is my home." "Just got back from a trip?" Second officer, a younger man who seemed to be scanning everything behind me, asked if I had identification. I stepped back inside and retrieved my wallet from my bag, handing over my license. The taller officer looked it over, glancing from the photo to my face and back again. I could see the gears turning as he checked the address. "Is anyone else home right now?" he asked. "No, my family's out of town visiting my in-laws. I came back a few days early. That's why the house was dark." They both nodded but didn't seem ready to leave yet. "Would you mind if we took a quick look around?" "Just to be sure everything's okay," the younger one said, trying to sound casual. I didn't like the idea, but I also didn't want to escalate anything. I stepped aside and let them in, watching as they moved through the entryway and into the living room, scanning the space as if expecting to find signs of forced entry. They opened a few doors, peeked into the kitchen and hallway, then returned to the front. One of them noticed my suitcase by the door and pointed at it. "Just got back, huh?" "Less than 20 minutes ago," I replied. The taller officer finally relaxed a bit and handed me back my license. "Everything checks out." "Sorry to bother you, sir, but we had to respond." A neighbor reported suspicious activity. I didn't have to ask which neighbor. I stepped out onto the porch, and sure enough, Karen was still standing across the street. Her arms crossed and her eyes locked on me like she expected the cops to drag me out in handcuffs. The officers gave her a quick wave and a nod, signaling that the situation had been handled. She didn't wave back. I turned to the officers. So, just to be clear, someone saw me enter my own home with a key, and instead of checking with me, they called the police. People get nervous, the younger one said, clearly trying to avoid conflict. We appreciate your cooperation. They left without further incident, but the tension remained. I stood on the porch for a few moments, the evening air now feeling colder than before. Karen eventually turned and went back inside, probably feeling proud of herself for keeping the neighborhood safe. I shut the door and leaned against it, the calm of home now tainted by a feeling of invasion not from the police, but from the reality that I had to prove myself in a place where I should have been beyond question. My house, my keys, my name, on the dettle of it had meant nothing in that moment. All it took was one phone call from someone who didn't like surprises. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me sit up, wondering what else she might report next. For the first time since I moved into the neighborhood, I didn't feel safe in my own home, not because of crime, but because of the people who thought they were preventing it. The next morning, the weight of what had happened still lingered. I woke up earlier than usual, not because of an alarm or anything urgent, but because I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The memory of the flashing lights, the questions, the doubt in the officers' voices, it all sat heavy in my chest. I paced the living room for a while, replaying every detail of the night before. I hadn't done anything wrong, and yet I'd been treated like I didn't belong, all because Karen decided I didn't look like someone who lived here. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. Kids waiting for the school bus, dog walkers making their rounds, sprinklers hissing across freshly cut lawns. It all looked so normal, but I didn't feel normal anymore. I felt exposed. And the worst part, I knew Karen had no regrets. In her mind, she'd just done her civic duty. She probably thought the police should have thanked her around 9 a.m. I decided to take control of the narrative before it took control of me. I grabbed a folder from my home office and started putting together documents, utility bills, mortgage statements, even the welcome letter from the HOA with my name and address clearly listed. It felt ridiculous to prove what I already knew. But after last night, I didn't trust assumptions anymore. I printed out a copy of my ID and stapled it to the top of the stack. As I looked at the small pile of paperwork, I realized how absurd this was. Who has to prove they belong in their own home? But then again, Karen had escalated a harmless situation into a police response without even knocking on my door. That kind of paranoia wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Around noon, I got a call from my wife. I debated whether or not to tell her, but I knew she'd eventually hear about it. So I explained everything, from Karen's phone call to the police's arrival, to the way I had to let strangers walk through our house to prove it was mine. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "This is beyond nosy, it's harassment." That was the word I hadn't used yet. Harassment. Because that's exactly what it felt like now that I could step back and look at the bigger picture. This wasn't the first time Karen had targeted someone, and I doubted it would be the last. But this time, she crossed the line. Later that afternoon, I walked down the street to the HOA office located at the edge of our gated community. It was a small building attached to the community center, with a smiling receptionist who greeted me politely. I asked to speak to someone about a serious incident involving a board member or at least someone acting like one. After explaining what happened, I submitted a formal complaint against Karen. The woman behind the desk seemed sympathetic, nodding as I spoke, but I could tell this wasn't the first complaint they'd received. She mentioned that while Karen wasn't officially on the board, she was one of the more active participants in community affairs. That didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was her final comment. "You're not the first neighbor," she's reported, "but you're the first who's filing a complaint." That said everything. People had been tolerating her behavior for too long, brushing it off as quirky or harmless. But what happened last night wasn't harmless. It was humiliating. And it wouldn't stop unless someone stood up and said, "Enough." I left the office that day with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about setting a boundary and making sure no one else had to prove they belonged in their own home because someone didn't like the way they looked, arrived, or lived. The days following the incident were strangely quiet. Karen didn't say a word to me, not a glance, not a nod, not even one of her signature passive-aggressive sticky notes. But her silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like a challenge, a power play. She thought calling the cops would intimidate me into falling in line. But all it did was wake me up. The emotional toll of being treated like a stranger in your own home doesn't fade quickly. Every time I passed a window, I found myself checking if she was out there watching. Each time a car slowed down near my driveway, my pulse would rise. I didn't feel comfortable walking out to my mailbox without glancing around. I hated that she had done that to me. Hated even more that it had worked, at least temporarily. But fear wasn't going to be the final word in this story. I had already filed a complaint with the HOA, and I wasn't going to stop there. I spent the next few days documenting everything. I started a timeline of interactions I'd had with Karen since moving in, every odd comment, every note, every unnecessary complaint about things like my porch light being too bright or my recycling bin being placed at the wrong angle. I even included screenshots from our neighborhood Facebook group, where Karen would post vague warnings about unknown vehicles or unusual activity without any specifics, comments that always seemed to align with certain neighbors. Being out of sync with her unwritten rules? One night, I sat down and wrote a letter addressed to every homeowner in our HOA. Not a rant. Not an attack, but a clear and calm explanation of what happened the night I came home early. I included the fact that the police had verified my identity, that I lived in the house, and that the call was made without any evidence of wrongdoing. I also mentioned how I wasn't the first person Karen had reported in. Be the last, unless something changed. Within a week, people began to respond. A few emailed me directly, thanking me for speaking up. One neighbor, an older man named George, who lived 2 doors down, stopped me while I was walking to my car and shared his own story. Apparently, Karen had once accused his grandson of wandering too much when he came to visit and had taken photos of him from across the street. Another neighbor told me she'd stopped hosting backyard barbecues because Karen would call the HOA to complain about unauthorized gatherings. The stories kept coming, and with them came support. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up early, folder in hand. The room was filled with the usual small talk and stale coffee, but there was a buzz in the air that hadn't been there before. When it came time for open floor discussion, I stood up and shared my experience. Not just what happened that night, but everything. The pattern, the fear, the silence, and how none of it belonged in a neighborhood where people should feel safe. And respected Karen was there too, sitting stiffly near the front with her arms crossed, lips tight, eyes narrow. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her glare said everything. But by then I didn't care. I wasn't looking for her approval or afraid of her retaliation. I was focused on the people who had started nodding as I spoke. That night marked a shift, not just for me, but for the entire block. For too long, everyone had been walking on eggshells. Now, they were ready to speak too. Karen's reign of control had met resistance. I hadn't asked for this fight, but now that it was, here I was going to see it through, not just for myself, but for every neighbor who deserved to come home without fear.